Turn to page 394 of your books. We're about to get started with the College Drop-In podcast brought to you by Roanoke College. My name's Ben Bentley, and with me, as always, is my wonderful co-host and colleague, Kees Van Hasteren. Kees, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Ben. We managed to get back for a second episode,
Did not think we'd
career
get this far.
episode number 2. We're doing all right so far.
So far, so good.
What do you think we make it to? Probably like 3 or 4 before our bosses tell us to stop?
I think 3 or 4, but, at least in this case, the sequel will be better than the original.
I certainly hope so. So what are we going to talk about today?
One of the big things that we mentioned in the first episode was how everything is changing. The main subject we're going to touch on today, after we just talk about a lot of the different changes going on in admissions, is going to be test optional. What school, what it is, kind of a little bit of the history, but it's a question that I've gotten asked a lot by rising seniors and even rising juniors. And I'm sure that you've gotten that question a lot as well from students. So it's kind of one of the biggest subjects, and it's something that a lot of schools are having to grapple with right now.
Yeah, I think what we're going to do with it is I think we're going to split it up into what test optional is like in a normal year and what test optional is like in a COVID year in 2 separate sections.
Yep.
So we're going to start by talking about what test optional normally looks like, and then we'll dive into the nitty gritty of what schools have been changing and how over the past couple of months to adapt to the fact that SAT keeps canceling dates.
Yep.
I mean, a lot has changed over the past couple of months. We haven't been able to bring students to campus and tell them all of this stuff in person. We haven't been able to go to college fairs and do that
Yeah.
stuff in person, although you did a virtual college fair recently, didn't you?
Yeah, it was really cool. Got to talk with a bunch of different students and actually some of the college counselors from a couple of schools that were sponsoring it. But it was a really cool experience, and it's, kind of showing how people are shifting to, the new norm, but still being able to connect us with people and bridge that gap that we talked about in the last episode.
What is test optional? I think that's kind of probably the important place to
Yeah.
start.
Yeah. Test optional it's your test scores aren't required to be submitted with your application. So you get to choose if it's going to play a factor when colleges review your application. Not every school is test optional, and there's some different thoughts on test optional in a normal year. Is there a negative stigma to it? How will it affect my applications? Will I still get money? Because merit scholarships are a big thing for a lot of students. And will the test scores or lack thereof play a role in that scholarship during a normal year? One thing, I was just going to say, shameless plug, some institutions have been test optional for a while. Roanoke College went test optional about 3 years ago. So some schools make it in a conscious effort for the students, but there's some negative connotations with why schools go test optional. I think we're going to touch on that in a minute. But what were you going to say? Didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, every school reviews test optional differently in the same way that every school reviews applications with test scores differently.
That's a very good point.
Roanoke College is going to be different from Harvard, is going to be different from your local community college, and is going to be different from every other school in between. And that's especially true on the test optional. So what you're doing when you're saying, I'm not going to submit my test scores, is you are giving us one fewer element to look at while we are reviewing your application. So that means every other aspect of your application in a holistic review process is going to be a little bit more in depth. Some schools say you probably shouldn't apply test optional if you are below X GPA, and that GPA is going to be a little bit higher than what your GPA might be able to do if you were submitting test scores. And that's something to take note of, is everyone reviews it differently, but in every scenario, that's going to mean that something is scrutinized a little bit more. and that's normally going to be your GPA or your essay or your resume or something of that nature.
The rigor of the courses that you've been taking in high school is another one.
Rigor of the courses is an excellent point. Yeah.
Yep.
So you already touched on this very briefly. Is merit scholarship still available for students who apply test optional?
In most cases, from what I've seen, it is. Obviously, as you just said, every single school reviews things, reviews applications differently. So they're going to touch on, merit scholarships differently. Some schools you automatically get reviewed for merit scholarship when you get accepted. Other schools you have to apply for their merit scholarships. So it's going to be different, but from what I've seen and colleagues I've spoken to, most students will still get considered for merit-based scholarships, mostly based off of their GPAs.
Yeah, the couple of places I've worked at that have been test optional have based that merit-based scholarship entirely off of the GPA, as opposed to both the GPA and SAT score. So that's really important. But I think it's also probably important to note that colleges kind of assume that if you are submitting test optional, your test scores are in a range that wouldn't necessarily be as appealing. So those test scores might not necessarily, or those merit scholarships might not necessarily be as high as you might have gotten with test scores. So that's something to bear in mind, and that's something to ask your specific admissions counselor about. Because I had this one girl a few years back. She was 4.0 and above student, had like a 1350 on the SATs, and she was sitting across from me telling me, I want to go test optional because I don't think I did as well on the SATs as I could have done. And I'm sitting there screaming, you're going to cost yourself $5,000 in merit-based scholarship, and I'm going to accept you either way. I mean, I didn't tell her I was going to accept her either way, but I was telling her that she could be costing herself some pretty significant scholarship money by not submitting those test scores, which were fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, which leads into a great point of what is a good test score, because I know when I was going through the college search, a lot of the people that I was talking to, that if it wasn't above a 1250, it wasn't good. But I think a lot of schools post their averages when they post test scores. And one thing I'm pretty sure we're going to say SAT a million more times than we're going to say ACT. We know the ACT is there. For some reason, we just always default to SAT.
I think that's a regional thing. I grew up in an area that was very SAT heavy up in Maine. You grew up in an SAT heavy area in Western Virginia. We didn't grow up in the Midwest where ACT is popular.
No, but I work with the Midwest students. So conscious effort for my students to say ACT a couple times as well. But as I was saying, it brings up the point of what is a good score. And you touched on it perfectly, saying talk to your admissions counselor about it, because, and looking at the averages, if your test score is on or above the average of that school, send it in. And if you've taken it multiple times, send in all of them, because super scoring is a phenomenal tool. A lot of schools super score for acceptance and for merit-based scholarship. Super scoring is taking the best elements of each section of the test, and if it was taken at different times, and putting them together and giving you the best possible score on paper.
I completely agree. If you have a score that's better than the average score for that school, send in your scores. Don't even blink an eye at it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, even if you're just below the average, we'll send it in. So Roanoke's average is about an 1160, 1170, somewhere in that range. If you're an 1100 or even like a 1080, 1090, you shouldn't really be thinking all that much about it. But again, that's another point where you ask your admissions counselor in a very specific way for whichever college you're applying to, or whichever college you're talking to. This is my exact scenario. Can you tell me if my SATs will improve my chances of getting accepted or hurt my chances of getting accepted, and will it improve my merit-based scholarship or will it hurt my merit-based scholarship? You really need to balance those two things and make sure that you're getting the most beneficial option in both scenarios.
Yeah.
So my question is, I think you may have touched on it earlier, the negative stigma. Is there
Yeah.
actually a negative stigma that surrounds test optional or test optional schools?
So yes, there is. A lot of times, especially when test optional first became a thing, there's a lot of articles and people talking saying, well, these schools only went test optional so they can start rejecting more people. Because again, as you said early on, that means other aspects of your application are getting more heavily scrutinized. So, there was a huge negative stigma around schools shifting to test optional. Obviously, we've seen a lot more schools go recently to test optional, and I think part of the thing, especially in the last 2.5 years, has been that negative stigma on the schools going test optional kind of going away, because a lot of people don't believe that the SAT or ACT can be an accurate depiction of a student as they are. I know personally, not a standardized test person. I did just good enough on the SAT to get into college. Let's put it that way. And there's other factors that play in. Some students need more times or have IEPs, and they're not able to show how strong they actually are academically. So that stigma has started kind of shifting away from schools that were originally test optional. It's not a way for schools to increase their applications just so they can reject 90% of the people that apply test optional anymore.
Yeah,
Or in the first place.
I think that that is a great point that you brought up about the stigma that used to surround applicants of that nature. Um,
Yeah.
and there were a lot of schools that said, "Oh, you're test optional. That means your scores weren't qualified. You're done, and
Mhm.
you don't want that." And you're exactly right that your SAT score is not necessarily a representation of who you are as a person. Um, I mean, my old boss used to tell us all the time that he scored under an 800 on his SAT. I won't name any names. And
Is it the one that I know?
no, it is not. And it was that he still got into college and got a job after college and got good grades while he was in college and is now the director of admissions someplace. But it means that you need to be able to have this opportunity for those type of people who are really good students, but they walk into that testing facility and it's not going to be their day for whatever reason. Like you
Yeah.
mentioned, if they have an IEP and require additional time, or maybe they just didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, or their calculator battery dies. That's
Yeah.
a hint. Always bring backup batteries for your calculator.
True.
Um, so I think that there really has been a move away from that negative stigma that people mention, but you still have to realize that admissions counselors are going to assume that your SAT scores aren't quite up to standard, and that's why you decided to go test optional, except for this year, because
Yes.
this year I think a
Completely different.
huge amount of people aren't going to get the opportunity to take the SAT or the
Mhm.
ACT. I'm trying to watch myself too now. Um, and that is because of this coronavirus thing that has been, it's canceled, I believe, 3 SAT test dates, which are the prime times for juniors to start getting their testing done.
It's definitely changed a lot, and I mean we're starting to see with what College Board has been putting out, specifically with the SAT, on the way they're prioritizing the dates that they still have available in August and September. To students that are going to graduate in 21 that haven't had SAT scores but were signed up. which giving people the opportunity to get those scores in, but it's not everyone's gonna have that opportunity, and ideally we're gonna still be able to have them take the tests at those times, but we don't know what's gonna happen in a month.
I mean, the College Board, they're a billion-dollar business, $1 billion a year in
With a
revenue
B,
with a B.
with a
Um,
B.
and that means they're going to innovate in or try to innovate in the same way as any other business. I've heard rumors of them talking about trying to find a way to be able to test from home, and they're going to try to innovate. I kind of seem to think that there is going to be some way for these students to take their tests and have them in time for a mid-October deadline, because
Mhm.
there are a bunch of mid-October deadlines out there and only 3 opportunities by mid-October to take the test. So I think they're going to really work their tail off to try to find a way to get the test out there and to take your whatever it is, $50 to take the
Yeah.
SAT. So I think they'll probably find a way, but in the current scenario, most students won't have taken the SAT or the ACT by application time. They certainly won't have had the opportunity to take it 2 or even 3 times before uh, that time period, like a lot of students have had the opportunities to do in the past.
A lot of that is, I mean, I know our office is kind of predicting we're going to have a bump in test optional applications, but kind of what we've seen is a lot of colleges are falling into, with everything going on with coronavirus when it comes to the tests. It seems like they're falling into one of three camps. So there's test optional, like us, that we said earlier. You decide to submit the scores. You decide if it plays a role. Then there's some schools that have been coined as test flexible. What this means is you can submit the SAT or ACT, or you can submit other test scores. So AP exams from earlier in your career, IB exams from earlier, your PSAT or pre-ACT. Schools are taking a step to become more flexible when it comes to what scores they're going to accept, and along with kind of seeing it doesn't have to be that official one from College Board is what some schools are saying. Is they're saying, hey, if you have your PSAT and you can self-report it to us, we will take that and we'll utilize that with application review. Then the last group is the ones that are saying, no, we still want the tests, which we'll see if they change their tune coming in the next few weeks and months, depending on what fall applications are starting to look like for them. But we're seeing people move into different camps for one reason or another. And I guess it's not really a camp, but it's more of the test flexible group. Schools like Swarthmore up in Pennsylvania, who have suspended the test score requirement for the next 2 years. So, giving those students the ability, and they will accept the PSAT and ACT. So they're kind of that test flexible type of school, at least for the next 2 years. But I think we'll see some long-term impacts, because one question that I kind of have with all of the schools that have just now transitioned to optional or flexible is kind of my thought is it necessary for them, or is it necessary for their students? What is the point that brought that change about?
Could they have done it last year or the year before if it took them 2 weeks or 3 weeks to come up with a plan to do it for next year? So I kind of tend to see this as it's going to be a heck of a lot more beneficial for their students to make this sudden change, because they were just kind of holding out hope that they could keep using the SATs forever, is kind of my thought. I mean,
Yeah.
a bunch of schools have made those changes, and it's not just less selective schools or stuff like that. I mean, 2 Ivy League schools, Harvard and Cornell, both announced new test optional or test flexible policies over the past month or so. And I mean, some of the most elite and selective small private schools in the country, like Williams and Amherst up in Massachusetts, did as well. So I think a lot of people are starting to fall into those test optional camps. And I don't know how they transition back. Like, how do you put that genie back in the bottle and say, hey, for the last 2 or 3 years, we accepted test optional, and now everyone's got to submit their test scores again. So that will be something that's curious to see over time. But a lot of schools are making that transition. And I think the schools that aren't, we might see a lot of them over the next 2 months or so once they've really finished working with their incoming senior class, make that final announcement that we're going test optional.
Yeah.
So I think we should probably call it quits there unless you have any final thoughts, Ben. Any last things that you want to say?
Um, I mean, not in regards to test optional. I think kind of hitting on the highlights that we mentioned. Talk to your school counselor. Talk to your admissions counselor. See, because you can apply test optional to some schools and send your scores into other ones. Just see what it'll be more beneficial for you to do and how to apply. And I know we mentioned it in the last podcast as well, but we would love to hear from you guys. Love to hear what your questions are. What are the big concerns for the people that are starting their search as a rising junior, or someone that's about to finish your virtual learning and become a senior in high school. So if you have any questions that you want us to address, send them to my email. My email is bentley@roanoke.edu. I hope we can use our work emails for that. I guess we should.
Probably should have checked that, but it's too late now.
Yeah, but it's already out in the void. So yeah, Bentley@roanoke.edu, like the car, no relation. But yeah, that's kind of it. Thanks for joining us today.
That could really be our slogan, though, is talk to your counselor.
Talk to your counselor.
That's going to be something we say over and over and over again, whether it's your high school school counselor or whether it is your admissions counselor. Talk to them, keep them up to date with what you're thinking.
We should get a graphic it's like the more you know rainbow, except it says the more you communicate is a good thing.
Well, thanks for stopping by, guys. I guess liking, subscribing, and reviewing us is a thing. And remember, you can get into college. Thanks for coming.
Yes, you can.